research approach. So what research approaches are available to us as psychologists? We typically differentiate between two research paradigms that we call positivist and post-positivist, or positivist and alternative. Sometimes we say natural science approach and humanities approach. But this is actually very close to positivist and post-positivist, as you will see very shortly. So, how did people conduct research in natural sciences? Let's take as an example the classical study of Stanley Milgram. Of course, you are probably familiar with this study, but if not, I will quickly remind you. Imagine that you read an announcement in newspaper inviting people to participate in psychological experimentation as assistant of an experimenter for $5. And you come to this laboratory and you see an experimenter who shows you this device which has many buttons with different voltages on them. And your job as assistant of an experimenter is to punish a participant who is behind the wall when they give wrong answers to tasks on a memory test. And the experimenter tells you that we are conducting a memory research with negative reinforcement. So your goal is to punish a person with electric shocks, increasing in intensity. And of course, what is really being studied is obedience, whether people would complain to this requirement of punishing another person behind the wall with electric shocks when experimenter tries to pressure them to do it. So if you say, oops, I don't think it is a good idea, Stanley Milgram would say as an experimenter, but you must continue. You have signed your consent to participate. You are getting a reward for this. This is important for science. You must, you should, and so on. So he is trying to pressure you into compelling. And of course, as a naive subject, you don't know that there is no person behind the wall. There is actually a recording that was made by special actor, and there is an assistant who turns this recording on at important moments. So what you see is that just as you press the button and you shock a person with electric shocks, you hear complaints. A person says, please stop doing it. It's painful. I have a weak heart. Oops, I think I'm going to faint, and so on. They start banging on the wall. And at some point, they even stop responding. Maybe they are passed out. And Stanley Milgram asked a question. What would be the percentage of people who would actually show this obedience? And in his study, he found that about 2/3 of people complained with this request of an experimenter, and they went as far as shocking a person behind the wall, allegedly to death. And then Stanley Milgram tried to understand what kind of reasons are important for people, why they obey. And he tried to vary different circumstances, different external characteristics of this situation. For example, instead of framing this research as being conducted by a laboratory at Yale, he would frame it as a research being conducted by some kind of independent small research lab. And then the percentage of people showing obedience dropped from 65% to 48 or so. Then he tried to vary the physical distance between the person behind the wall and the person who is actually giving electric shocks, or tried to put in charge of the experiment, instead of a professor, just some kind of graduate student, or instead of a male, a female. And in all these cases, he found that obedience actually dropped. So he inferred that all these characteristics are important to create this obedience to authority. However, his study did not provide any answer to those questions. What is different about people who actually obey and who don't? Why do people stop obeying? Because if you see a video recording, and it can easily be found on YouTube, if you search for Milgram obedience study, you see that when people give electric shocks, they don't do it automatically. They actually stop and think, should I really do it? Should I really obey? And they make this decision to obey. So why do people take this decision in some way or other? Stanley Milgram's study did not answer that, because he was only interested in the general pattern. a nomothetic approach, right? Discover the general law, discover the general statistical pattern. We can say that 65% obey authority, but why they obey and why those who don't obey, we don't know. So in this natural scientific study, he used external circumstances to shape, and he asked the question how they shape people's behavior, but he did not ask the question why. And you can find many other studies focused on those external variables. As an example of a bit more trivial study, I recently saw a paper in one journal on management, actually one of the top ranking journals, where the authors have discovered an association between body weight and salary that people receive. And they discovered that this association is somewhat nonlinear, and it has somewhat different shape for males and females. So for males, those who have higher weight, they get sometimes more money, but then this kind of tapers off and starts even dropping. Whereas for females, you see there is a steady negative association which starts to drop. And the question is, why does this association take place? Of course, you can find many different explanations about people's health or beauty standards or differences in occupations of males and females and so on. But this study does not answer the question why. It only says, okay, there is this statistical association. And this statistical association is established with high degree of confidence in a very large sample. But why does it take place? We don't know. And another more important question, is this association even important? Because if you look at all the range of salaries that is explained by this weight variable, you see that actually all the individual differences in terms of weights that are explained by salary are quite low. Within about 200 or 300 euro. For men and for women, it's a bit more. For men, it's a bit less. But still, all this range is very small. And of course, salary depends on so many things, on a person's position, on a person's experience, on a person's education, and many, many other things, qualifications, and so on. So, do we even need to know a person's body weight to predict their salary? Probably, if we wanted to know it, it would be one of the last things that we want to know. This association is kind of trivial. But you can find many such studies in psychology that answer this question of association, but don't answer the question why. And the archetype, the general paradigm of these studies is this natural science approach that we can also call the black box approach. Because our research object that we are studying is like a black box. We are not really looking inside this black box. And this research object can be basically anything. It can be a human being, or it can be a rat in a maze, or it can be an alien spaceship. We just look at some external variables that we try to influence. For example, we place a rat into different types of maze. Or for human beings, we vary the circumstances in which the experiment is taking place, who is conducting the experiment, for example, male or female, how does it affect behavior. So we only focus on external variables that we can objectively observe, and we understand that our definition of objective is external. This is the epitome of natural science approach. And we look at other external variables that we can objectively measure or observe or record, and we try to take into account some potential confounds. For example, how fast does a rat run through a maze? It is explained obviously by the characteristics of the maze, but it may also be explained by the characteristics of a rat. For example, is it hungry or not? Or at what time of day does this experiment take place? So we try to eliminate all the individual differences. We try to take rats that are exactly the same in terms of how fat they are, we conduct the experimental series at exactly the same time of day to ensure that there are no systematic differences between different rats who participate in our experiment. So we try to ensure that all the individuals are quite the same, as similar as our research objects. And here you can see that researcher is actually kind of outside this situation. He or she has organized this situation, he has built or she has built this maze, and now she or he is observing the subjects within this maze. And subject, even the very word experimental subject, translates some asymmetry of power, because subjects in English language, we say also subjects of Her Majesty the Queen, and so on. So subject is a person who is subject to certain influences. And this natural scientific approach allows us to establish some associations between external variables. As long as we study something that is universal to all human beings, more or less, we're fine. But when we try to understand, for example, why do people obey authority? What is important in determining this choice? An ethical choice, actually. There is no way we can understand it well by just varying external circumstances. We need to ask a person. So we need to apply a different alternative approach. We need to ask a person to explain to us the reasons for their behavior. We basically try to open this black box to answer the question of why. And this already is not natural scientific paradigm anymore, because when we want to ask the person a question, we have to interact with them. We are not independent of our experiment anymore. We may actually influence this reality that we are studying with some kind of assumptions that we bring in, or how we ask the question can influence the answers that the person is giving to us. So this positivist, this natural scientific ideal of experimenter being completely independent of their research does not hold anymore. But still, this is a completely scientific, completely valid research. So the comparison between those two paradigms is proposed in a paper by Robert McGrath and his colleague Johnson, a chapter actually in the book by Kamick, Rhodes and Yardley that you can find in our reading materials. And they compare those two paradigms, a positivist paradigm that we rely on when we actually try to conduct some experiment. For example, experiments in social psychology or experiments in cognitive psychology, they are typically conducted based on this approach. We say that experimental findings should be completely independent of experimenter. Experimenter should not interact with his subjects in any way. He should not, or she should not, influence them in any way. And we try to isolate all the phenomena we're studying from the context. We try to take a person and bring them into a special isolated lab, and we pretend that they don't bring their values with them. We pretend that we have completely isolated them from all external influences. And we try to make science completely free from values. We try to ensure that science has nothing to do with values. There is this asymmetry of power. There is experimenter who is above the situation and the subject who is within the situation, who is running within this maze or who is influenced by this experimental situation. And we try to explain, we look for general laws, and we try to explain everything with cause and effect laws that are general for all participants in our experiment. So this is positivist assumption, just like in this Stanley Milgram study. The alternative paradigm, it is typically used by qualitative research, when we try to understand why did a person make an important life choice in a certain way, or why did they cope with a certain situation in a certain manner. There is no way we can do it using an experiment. The only approach is to conduct an interview, to come to this person and to ask them to describe their life world to us. And in this case, there is no asymmetry of power anymore. Instead of subject, we say respondent or participant. And in terms of power, we are equal, because a person He or she is like a guide into their life work for us as researchers. And we acknowledge the fact that our research facts, our research findings are interdependent with ourselves, because the way we ask questions is influenced potentially by our values, by our pre-existing expectations, and we try to understand these expectations, we try to clarify them before we start asking questions. But there is no way we can pretend that our personalities do not influence the way we conduct interviews or the findings. We just try to control for it by asking other people to look at our findings, for example, or by trying to ensure that our questions are not biased, and so on. And when we try to understand a personal life, the world that a person is living in, we try to understand the context. We try to understand what kind of values influence them. And we try to, instead of using just simple cause-effect explanations, we try to understand complex patterns through many different forms of causality, bottom-up and top-down in terms of our previous schema, multi-level model, and so on. So these are kind of two different ideals of science, or two different strategies. Nomothetic strategy that tries to find out general laws, establish them statistically, and then explain individuals. And this is the strategy that is typically taken by quantitative research. Whereas another strategy that relies on post-positivist paradigm is ideographic strategy. We try to describe the uniqueness of an individual case, and to analyze it, to understand it through its meaningful connections with the context. And only based on this description, based on this knowledge, we try to make hypotheses about the general laws that may be generalizable to other individuals. For example, why do people obey authority? We ask a participant to describe their experience, and then based on this description, we make hypotheses. Okay, maybe these values or these meanings or these personal dispositions are important. And then we can test this hypothesis in a nomothetic study. So basically, those two approaches are typically used in quantitative and qualitative research. And they are not kind of alternative views of science. I would say that they are mutually compatible. In some stages of your research, you may be interested in doing an ideographic series. In some stages of your research, you may want to test the hypothesis that you have inferred from your interviews using a questionnaire study to establish a general association between some variables. So both of these strategies are equally scientific, are equally valid. And it is by combining those two strategies that we can conduct stronger studies. So basically, we have, as psychologists, available to us positivist and post-positivist views of research. And we have available to us different research approaches. When to use which of them? Well, my argument would be, if you are studying something that is very universal, something that is based at the level of physiology or neurons or elementary cognitive processes, then classical natural science paradigm works quite well. For example, if we go to participate in an experiment of our colleagues who study attention next door, typically in their research they use something like 20 students of psychology department, because those processes that they study are supposed to be completely universal in different individuals. However, if you are interested in some individually specific phenomena, for example, why do people obey or disobey authority, or how do people cope with a life crisis, and why do people cope with life crisis in some way or other? This is when you actually need to acknowledge the potential diversity, the diversity of developmental stages, the diversity of regulation mechanisms the diversity of explanations for the same behavior that may be valid for different individuals. And this is where our classical paradigms that are aimed at establishing general laws don't really do a good job, because you may find a very general pattern of some kind of a very weak association, which will give you a very blurry picture. But if you try to look into individual diversity, you will see that actually there are some interesting individual patterns. And this is why maybe you need to use some interview studies to inform your research. Or sometimes you may even be able to use some more complex quantitative approaches. For example, one colleague at dinner who studies well-being, he was one of the proponents of so-called hedonic adaptation theory. Basically, the idea is very simple. The idea is that when something good happens to us, our level of happiness grows. But then, after a certain amount of time, maybe after a few months or after a year, our level of happiness comes exactly to the same level as it used to be before. And people who proposed this model, they said that it's like hedonic treadmill. We always need to get something new in order for our happiness level to change. And then at dinner said that they analyzed the effects of marriages. And they said that indeed, on average, when people marry after 2 years, on average, they get back to the same level of happiness. However, if you look at individual diversity, there are some people who remain after marriage to be happier than they used to be before. But there are some people also who, after marriage, become even more unhappy than they used to be before. So it is this individual diversity that we need to account for. And right now we have very complex quantitative models like mixture models, for example, to study this kind of data very efficiently. So some take-home messages from today's lecture, some conclusions that I would propose, which you may agree with or not. Psychology is definitely a science, but we should not expect it to be like biology or physics. There are some parts of psychology, mainly neuroscience or cognitive science, that are closer to biology and physics in terms of models and approaches and the types of explanations that we use. But some parts of psychology, those that are close to psychotherapy, for example, or personality psychology, in some ways they are closer to humanities, because that is where hermeneutic and hagiographic approaches might sometimes be even more important than the good old nomothetic approach. So we can use the classical measurement and experimentations, or we can use the post-positivist interviews and phenomenological approaches and descriptive methods that we share with humanities. And both types of these approaches may or may not help us to gain better knowledge. Everything depends on the research questions that we want to apply them to. And within our course, we will start to look at different research questions, and we'll start to see how different methods are applicable to different research questions. So, unlike people who have very simple explanations, psychologists always, when asked to explain human behavior, psychologists usually answer that it depends. So if you answer it depends, you have this complex picture in your head, and then you're a real psychologist. And I guess this is our goal in this course. So we have arrived at the end of our lecture. I will usually propose some questions for self-assessment that if you have listened through this lecture, you are supposed to be able to answer in some way or other. So these are these questions that I would propose you to focus on. And again, in terms of reading, in our folder you can find, I recommend a bit of Ken Sheldon's book, which describes the multi-level model, and I recommend either a chapter from the book by Kemick and others about two paradigms, or you can take a look at Ponterotto's paper where also the same two paradigms are being described in slightly different words. If you are interested to go in deeper, you can look at some additional sources. So I thank you so much for your attention, and I hope to see you next time very soon. Bye bye.